Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Cuthbert. Welcome to Prime Time Radio. You know, we like to tell folks when asked that we talk about aging, health, finance, sports, history, and interesting people who've done interesting things with their lives, plus, of course, much more. We have with us this week a guest who fills many of those categories. Dr. Shlomo Breznitz was born in then Czechoslovakia, moved to Israel after the Second World War, received degrees in psychology, and eventually served as professor of psychology at the University of Haifa. He also became rector or president of that university. He was elected to the Israeli Knesset, leaving office in 2007. He also founded CogniFit, a company that works on developing and maintaining mental fitness. We're going to try to touch on all aspects of his active and productive life as we visit with him in our studios. Dr. Breznitz, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Your childhood was, to say the least, traumatic. You lost your father to Auschwitz, your sister Yehudit, and you were put in separate parts of a Catholic orphanage where you had to pass as Christians. At what point and in what ways did those early years influence your interest in and eventual development of a career in psychology?
It's a fascinating question, and actually I was once asked to write a chapter in a book, to contribute a chapter that dealt with issues that you just raised, and that is to what extent the topic of research that one deals with in adult life draws on early experiences or not. I must say that personally I'm a little on the skeptical side here. I'm not so sure that one can really make those traces. It's not difficult to see such traces, but it's post facto, and that's rather easy to go backwards and find the connections. I am not so sure that I could confidently say that because I have been overwhelmed by stressful experiences in my childhood, I eventually became a professor of psychological stress. But I'm sure that my colleagues will debate this point with me.
Well, I was trying to imagine, you weren't that old when you were put in the orphanage, were you? What, 4 or 5?
No, I was 8.
8?
Yes.
But to you, to a certain extent, that was normal life. You didn't have anything to compare it with. And yet, here you were a Jewish kid, afraid of anybody finding out you were circumcised, and you were so successful at becoming a Christian that the sisters predicted you would become the first Jewish pope. That had to affect you somehow.
Well, luckily I didn't know about this. It was only after the war when they shared this information with my mother, who returned from Auschwitz. And I think it was fortunate that I was not aware of it. But I think that the reason they believed this was just one single aspect of my behavior, and that was I, at that time, had exceptionally good memory, and I could recall and remember quite well very long prayers in Latin, which I could not understand myself. I had no idea what the prayers meant, but just by listening to the nuns reading those prayers, and I think that they too probably didn't know much Latin, but they were reading them aloud, and I picked it up. And they found out that I can remember these long, long litanies, and they saw in it some sign of something.
You were extraordinarily gifted to them, then.
I was lucky.
How did your experience, though, differ with the nearly identical experience of your sister?
Well, she was almost 5 years older, so in some respects she had it harder, and in some respects easier. It was harder on her because I think she understood better than I did at my age what's going on around in the world. She had it easier perhaps because she was among the oldest girls in the orphanage. She was also very pretty and likable, and she managed, actually, when we compared our notes many, many years later, it turned out that her time was not as bad as mine.
In fact, I read somewhere where she said that far from bothering her, being raised as a Christian young woman actually sort of helped her.
Yes, and I must say that the same is true about me. When you are entirely alone and quote-unquote abandoned by your parents, you try to cling to any belief that you can find. And I become a very devout Catholic, praying very, very devoutly in the hope that this is the least that I can do in order to convince God Almighty to bring my parents back.
So what happened to your belief and yourself when your mother suddenly appeared, but your father did not?
Well, like everything, it's very complicated.
Sure.
But after the war, I, in fact, returned to Judaism. As a sort of ethnic identity, I had no conflict. I had no problem.
Our guest is Dr. Shlomo Breznitz. He's former president of the University of Haifa, professor of psychology, former member of the Israeli Knesset, and founder of Cognifit, an online mental fitness resource. Is it possible then, I'm just guessing, because the whole thing is fascinating to me, that it was more traumatic for you to go from the orphanage to Israel after the war than it was to be in the orphanage without your parents?
I wouldn't say that far. I wouldn't go that far. Yeah. But there were these things. The stressors were very different. Coming to Israel, I came by myself, not with my sister and my mother. In fact, they did not want to leave Czechoslovakia at the time, and I left with a group of youngsters my age. There were 20 of us that went to live on a kibbutz in Israel.
This is a leap, but again, curious about the influences on a young developing mind of what you went through and how it comes out the other end. For example, you're working currently with Cognifit, as we mentioned, a company whose purpose is to achieve and maintain brain fitness. I was curious if you've traced at all, since you were largely unnourished by parental love at a young age, how that brain fitness or brain preparation in early life now is related to the work you're doing with brain fitness in older life.
Mm-hmm. The only line that I can think of right off, I mean, there might be others, and I really appreciate this question. I should have thought about it myself before this interview, is the game of chess. I have always been an avid chess player, and in the orphanage it saved me many times, because I was a very good chess player as a child, and the older boys wanted my advice in the game, and then I got some protection from them instead. So that's the only thing that I can think of. The other aspect of chess is that it is a perfect escapism from worry and fear, because the game requires full commitment of your attention. You cannot really play reasonably good chess or serious chess and at the same time think of something else. So I found it as a escape route to some extent, because when you are immersed in a game of chess for several hours, everything else stops.
Before we leave the orphanage, I understand that while the nuns originally looked at you as a potential pope candidate, they eventually gave up on you. They became disillusioned with you because you were focused on other things. What was that end story or the end game of your relationship with the nuns?
No, actually, that did not happen the way you raised it. I was, until the end, I think, behaving very, very properly in terms of their expectations. And also, I often volunteered to help in a local, it was like an improvised hospital which they made for the war casualties, the wounded, in the basement of the orphanage. And I would often volunteer to spend the night and help the nuns to take care of these wounded soldiers, and among them German soldiers. And they actually saw this as another good sign that I would be willing and interested in doing this. But it made a great impression on me, particularly because I saw a lot of suffering and many people dying in front of my eyes in that hospital. But the sisters were very, very exceptional, particularly the Mother Superior, the head of the orphanage. She was very courageous. She protected my sister and me, even though she knew that if we would be found out by the Germans, who often looked for hidden children, she and the entire orphanage might be killed by the German soldiers. And yet she was brave and very, very decent person, and did the right thing, fortunately.
Our guest is Dr. Shlomo Breznitz. He is currently working with Cognifit after a long academic career and political career as a member of the Israeli Knesset. You have studied many things about your life, and one of the things you've studied is late memories of childhood. And I'm curious how your experience in the orphanage in your childhood affected later memories, and exactly psychologically, what are those? The only concept I could think of on my own was the later memories are these memories that are hidden, that are coming up about child abuse we hear all the time, but that may not be it. What are later memories?
No, the issue that you raise actually tied with the question I debated with myself for many years, whether I should write my memoirs or not, and when should I do it. And I delayed and procrastinated for many years, and then towards when I finally did it, I thought that it was fortunate that I delayed so long. And the reason that I thought so, and I still believe so today, is that whenever you write your memories, which are often reconstructions of things rather than true, and there is not one truth anyway, I mean, these things change all the time, rather than just veridical report of precisely what happened. There is always a very strong temptation on the person who writes about himself and people close to him to cheat. And there are many different kinds of cheating, not necessarily intentional or cheating with awareness that you are cheating. But when you don't remember well, the stories turned out often nicer than they truly were. And there are also many aspects of one's own behavior which are not so positive necessarily. And when one is young, I think one cares more